Based on what I see online, people tend to either think medieval Catholicism was hopelessly corrupt and idolatrous, or it was absolutely perfect and needs to be brought back immediately. I think it's high time we do away with any of our modern biases and give a real boots-on-the-ground look into late medieval faith, warts and all. By the 14th and 15th centuries, every aspect of life in Western Europe was absolutely drenched in Catholicism. This had two results which really depended on the person. For some, it created this actual sense of deep piety, and we're going to talk about that later in the video, but for others, it was more like going through the motions. And yet, even those motions were built on a culture that truly believed salvation mattered, and pretty much everyone was susceptible to at least occasional outbursts of extreme religiosity. In France, historians estimate that about 1/10 of the population was devoutly Catholic, 1/10 was Catholic in name only and didn't really participate in their religious duties, and the rest were all over the spectrum. If you and I were at a medieval French mass, we might be surprised to see that a lot of the nobles would leave the second mass was over, and contemporary chroniclers accused them of scarcely saying a paternoster within the church walls. Theologians lamented the fact that people would chat to each other during mass, or that the youth would treat churches as places for flirting. The writer Christine de Pizan has one of her characters say with a straight face, "If I often go to church, it is all for seeing the fair one, fresh as a new-blown rose." The preacher Michel Minot spoke out against the common practice of prostitutes soliciting clients at mass, and there are even reports of obscene pictures being sold to people as they walked out of the church. Pilgrimages could sometimes turn into excuses for a boozy vacation, and clerics were accused of drinking and gambling during vigils. A French bishop complained that when mass was celebrated for rulers, they would basically multitask and let the priests do their thing while they themselves conducted their royal business and attended to visitors at the same time. It's easy for us to criticize these things or see this as a faith that was ripe for reform, but it's also just the necessary byproduct of a culture where everything, no matter how mundane, was geared towards God. There were also quite a few early reformers like Jean Gerson and Nicolas de Clemanges that saw the church itself as drowning in excess. To them, it seemed like every day there were new saints being introduced, new feast days, new relics, and devotions. It's worth noting that the common people loved this stuff and had a lot of fun with it, but purists saw it as cluttering the faith. You probably already know about the selling of indulgences, so you don't need me to tell you that those sorts of practices didn't really help. It's hard to wrap our heads around it, but it wasn't unbelief that was the problem. It was sort of overbelief and the increasingly pedestrian nature of faith. As modern Catholics, it seems like we all kind of yearn for Catholicism to be a bigger part of pop culture and everyday life, but that actually happened in the Middle Ages and it didn't always have great results. When religion seeps into everything, everything becomes religious, and then sometimes nothing ends up being sacred. That immersion produced masterpieces of devotion, the cathedrals and hymns and art that still blow us away 700 years later. But with that said, nothing is ever black and white, and don't listen to anyone who tells you it is. In late medieval Europe, folk pageants with pagan roots got mixed in with sacred processions, love songs became the basis of mass compositions, kings and nobles started to be described in divine language that was usually reserved only for scripture. We can even see it in the artwork of the period. One of my favorite paintings of all time is the Melun diptych created by the French court painter Jean Fouquet around 1452. On the left is Etienne Chevalier, the rich patron of the artwork, who's rocking an insane haircut, and Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr. On the right is the Virgin Mary with the Christ child, but Mary isn't portrayed the same way here as she was in earlier medieval art. What's immediately noticeable is that her left breast is hanging out of her corset, and don't act like that wasn't the first thing you saw. More importantly, she has the high, plucked hairline of a late medieval noblewoman, this rich blue dress and white mantle with a jewel-encrusted crown. She's believed to be an idealized portrait of Agnes Sorel, mistress of King Charles VII, so what is she doing in this painting as a representation of the Virgin Mary? Well, this is the crossover of the sacred and the profane that came to be increasingly common in late medieval art. This raises an important question: when does creating religious images like these cross over into idolatry? These images taught scripture to the illiterate and gave ordinary people a window into divine mysteries, but some critics called them idols of stone and gold. The church warned against this all the time and spent a lot of energy to remind people that a painting of a saint or of Christ was just a painting, but the medieval mind loved shiny things and color and theatrical displays. So far, I've perhaps presented things a bit negatively, but history isn't a a single story, and there were plenty of genuinely pious rulers, like King Louis IX or Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who gave constantly to the poor and had his rosary and reliquary with him wherever he went. Sometimes you get piety and debauchery in the same person, like Louis of Orleans, who was an insane lover of luxury and allegedly addicted to necromancy, but who also lived with monks and heard 5 or 6 masses a day. I think one of the cool things about modern Catholicism is that it's there for those who choose it, although it has certainly lost the cultural footing it had in medieval Europe. If we were to hop out of a time machine in the Catholic Middle Ages, I think we would also be shocked at the prevalence of what were called cults of the saints. The French art historian Émile Malle writes that saints were never better loved than during the 15th and 16th centuries. Just looking at late medieval England, there are saints everywhere. They're engraved on drinking cups and bowls, their names are given to children at baptism, their images are carved in stone and painted on church walls, the list goes on and on. They made the faith real and tangible and vibrant to the average person. In 1488, a church in Norfolk kept lamps burning not just before images of Mary and John, but also before images of Saints Margaret, Anne, Petronella, Catherine, and Michael the Archangel. This was super common and something you would see in pretty much any medieval church. 80 to 100 days in the year, apart from Sundays, were days dedicated to saints, where every kind of work except the most necessary agricultural work was forbidden. Let's also talk about Mass, because there seems to be a lot of confusion when people think of medieval Mass. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. Not everybody consistently attended Mass or even understood what it was. There was a French knight who was asked why he didn't go to Mass even though it was so important for the salvation of his soul. His reply was, "This I knew not. Nay, I thought that the priests performed their Mass for the offering's sake." This actually gives us an important clue about late medieval Catholicism. There was a mystery to it, and the priests seemed to hold a special power. Lay people couldn't even touch the sacred vessel that held the blood of Christ unless their hands were covered with a special cloth. Critics through the ages have looked at details like this and said, see, medieval Catholics didn't participate in Mass, they just observed it, and they didn't even know what it was. Quotes like the alleged one from the French knight I mentioned earlier are cherry-picked to support this thesis. The truth is, of course, much more complicated. Let's first recognize that there wasn't one singular medieval Mass, and people experienced Mass in a variety of settings. There was the parish Mass, celebrated at the high altar, which was physically distanced from the crowd and partially covered by a screen. During Lent, the setup was different, and a huge veil was hung in the sanctuary area that completely blocked the people's view of what the priest was doing. I want to also look at this from another angle. All of this added to the experience of the liturgy. The screen and the veil were boundaries between the people's part of the church and the holiest of holies. They obscured, for a short time, something which was normally accessible, which heightened the value of the spectacle and helped even the simplest layman understand that something momentous was occurring. Also, a lot of people went to daily Mass, which would have been the most common experience of Mass, and those weren't the same kinds of elaborate rituals. People would see and hear everything, and these daily celebrations were accessible to everyone. We should talk about some individual medieval figures too, because they can show us how big this spectrum was between devout belief and not caring about faith at all. There was William the Conqueror's son, William Rufus, who cared more about hunting than praying and constantly made jokes at the expense of priests. When one of them warned him about damnation, he said, "I'll take my chances with the devil." There was also Frederick II Hohenstaufen, Holy Roman Emperor, who preferred reading Aristotle to scripture and allegedly wrote a book called The Three Impostors that claimed Christ, Moses, and Muhammad were all frauds. The popes of his day claimed he was the Antichrist. So we can see that not everyone in the Middle Ages was a good, faithful Catholic, although there were plenty of those. Just look at King Charles V of France, who was about as zealous as they come. According to Christine de Pizan, he made the sign of the cross as soon as he woke up, and his first words of the day were always prayers to God. He would celebrate High Mass in his personal chapel every morning and Low Mass afterwards. To add some detail here, High Mass was the full kit and caboodle with incense and chant and pageantry, and Low Mass was the quieter, more personal, and less glamorous version. Charles is interesting too because he gives us a look into the late medieval Catholic obsession with relics. He collected tons of them, like a piece of Moses' rod, the top of John the Baptist's head, a flask of the Virgin Mary's milk, the swaddling clothes of the infant Christ, and a fragment of the true cross. I know we can look at stuff like this as quirks of the medieval mind, and Protestants have a field day with relics when they're critiquing historical Catholicism, but I would just say that you should pause before applying a modern mindset to a person or concept from the past. Charles lived in a world full of mystery and chaos and also didn't have access to the kind of medical care we have today. Throughout his life, he suffered from severe headaches, toothaches, chronic indigestion, and a weird abscess on his left arm that constantly oozed pus. In fact, a doctor once told him that if the abscess ever stopped oozing pus, he would die within 10 days. And this was the King of France, who had access to the finest education and the best medical resources of his day. I think we can understand why he might want a few holy relics in his possession just in case they might help with his problems. But let's move on here and strike at the heart of one of the most common criticisms of medieval Catholicism, that the average Catholic layperson had no idea what their faith was about and mostly just hoped that their parish priest was doing something magical that would save everyone's souls. Again, we can look at a cherry-picked quote like that one from the French Knight and try to stretch it to cover all of medieval Catholicism, but looking at the facts, we can see it doesn't really fit. On the 14th century baptismal font in the parish church of Bradley in Lincolnshire, there is an inscription that reads Pater Noster Ave Maria Creed, Learn the child it is need. This inscription was directed at godparents and was part of the rite of baptism in late medieval England. Just before the baby was baptized, the priest would tell the godparents that it was their job to make sure the parents educated the child and taught it the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Apostles' Creed, as well as the laws of the Holy Church. It's obvious that everyone was expected to know the core components of the faith. There was also the English Council of Lambeth in 1281, which drew up what was called De Informatione Simplicium. It was a scheme for common Christian teaching, and it centered around the Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, the 7 works of mercy, the 7 virtues, the 7 vices, and the 7 sacraments. In other words, these were all things that pretty much every English Catholic would know, and they were thought to provide a comprehensive guide to Christian belief and practice. I want to talk a little here about the private internal world of the average medieval Catholic. Pretty much every nobleman or woman would have owned and carried with them a Book of Hours, which was the most fashionable religious accessory of the 14th century. These books were custom made and filled with personal prayers inserted among the day's devotions and penitential psalms. They're full of incredible illustrations of biblical stories and saints' lives, but you also see in the margins that there are devils and fools and soldiers fighting with rabbits. Again, in late medieval Catholicism, the sacred and the profane mixed together for better or worse. All Catholics, whether noble or not, were expected to pray regularly, fast when necessary, and meditate on the events of Christ's Passion. Sometimes the private and the communal would cross over, and it was common for average everyday people to purchase fabric and furnishings for their local parish church. They wanted to beautify and sanctify the church for a community purpose, but they also wanted to show their individual devotion by helping to decorate such a holy place. Faith belonged to everybody, not just the clergy. But let's land the plane here. Medieval Catholicism was a lot of things to a lot of different people. It was intensely sacred and inspired the kind of devotion we can only dream about today, but also by the late Middle Ages, it had become somewhat bloated and corrupt. What this meant to your average everyday Catholic varied from person to person. There were attacks on clergy and riots in the street against the overreach of the church, but there was also a beautiful and vibrant Catholic culture that was thoroughly cherished. When we look back at history, it's always important that we don't see things as black and white and we don't apply our own modern biases. There were many wonderful things about Catholicism in the Middle Ages that we would do well to remember. Processions, feast days, awe-inspiring architecture and art, but I don't see anyone arguing that we should start selling indulgences again. But what do you think? Does medieval Catholicism get a fair shake historically, or do people try too hard to impose their own narratives? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.